the Commission, through the Commission's proceedings, that foreign interference affects or can affect all political parties. That's certainly true. In terms of providing information to political parties, what about there have been other ideas suggested of how classified information might be provided. For instance, if the leader is a privy councillor, would that entitle them to receiving such information?
There are privy councillors who were sworn in the 70s. As an example, Marco Mendicino was made a privy councillor when he became a minister. But now that he is no longer a minister, in order to appear before this commission and to deal with documents that he himself had generated and worked with as minister, he needed to get security cleared once again. There is a perception around this town that being a privy councillor allows for a higher degree of security clearance or access to documents than not being a privy councillor is. That's simply not true in concrete terms. Ministers have access to secure documents by dint of their roles of ministers and go through a vetting process that clears them for that before they are appointed ministers. But having been a minister years ago does not give you any inherent ability to see classified documents without re-upping or reinstating a security clearance.
Okay. Well, we'll leave that topic for now and go to, I'll ask the registrar to pull up the CSIS IR, which I've lost the doc ID. Can doc 44, please? So, Prime Minister, this is the questions I want to ask you around this are about the Commission, and it does relate a little bit to the last point you were making, but the Commission essentially asked the government in its proceedings to come up with a list of the significant instances of foreign interference in Canada's democratic institutions and electoral processes over the period of the Commission's review. And this exercise sort of seems brought everyone around the table, considering what was initially a longer list produced by CSIS, and what was eventually obtained was a consensus list of these 6 instances. And many of the incidents that we've heard about over the Commission's proceedings are actually not on this list, but there are 6 that are there. So the first thing I'll ask you is specific, and then I'll actually go to some more general ones. But in terms of being informed about instances as a party leader, on the second bullet there on that list reads, reporting indicates that a foreign government undertook several actions, including interference, to reduce the likelihood of a specific Liberal candidate from being elected federally. It is suspected that the foreign government sought to thwart the candidate's bid, given their support for issues perceived to be contrary to the foreign government's interests. And am I correct in saying that this never came to your attention, this particular instance, before the Commission's proceedings?
Yes, the list of 6 were all, I expected that, as I said, I have access to regular intelligence briefings and updates on these things. It was surprising to me to see number 2 on this list, because I had no idea. And there are lots of details about this that I know that I continue to be astonished that I was not apprised of this, because it was relevant in a whole bunch of different ways and would have been very relevant at the time. But I also understand, without being able to give too much timing or details around this, that processes we have in place now would have meant that there is no doubt I would have been informed about this incident were it happening now. When it happened, we did not have the measures that we have subsequently put in place.
Okay, understood. So this is one you would have liked to see?
Yes, I would have liked to have seen this one.
Another thing we've heard about the development of this list is, as I said, it brought deputy ministers around the table having conversations about whether some of the instances were or were not foreign interference. And you mentioned earlier in your remarks that there can be different perspectives across government on whether activities are really standard diplomatic activity, for example, or foreign interference. How do you see those debates happening from your vantage point as Prime Minister, first sort of in the existential sense, like, is this a good thing? And when does it come to you, and what do you see? Are different perspectives brought to your attention, or how does this play out?
I think it is a very, very good thing that on something as important and sensitive as foreign interference by another state, that there be different perspectives looking at it. As I said, our diplomats in the United States were very alert to, which members of Congress or which governors might be helpful in making a case for a more successful NAFTA renegotiations than others. And that involved a lot of sort of conversations and looking into voting records and, quiet lunches by diplomats in place. And that gathering information on foreign parliamentarians is a core part of diplomacy. And that can be foreign influence, which is something that diplomats are actually hired to do and is a primary job around the country, make sure that the government of the country that you're in representing Canada looks favorably upon Canada, without crossing into interference. Now, it is possible to use information collected for purposes of influence to then turn around and use it for interference. If a diplomat were to collect the home address of a particular parliamentarian to be able to send them a personal note or a Christmas card that didn't go through the office, that would seem, okay, I'm trying to influence them, make them friendly. That's the work of diplomacy. If that foreign address, that home address was then used to organize a massive intimidation protest in the street in front of that person, paid for by a foreign country, that would be foreign interference, or that would be much more serious. So there is a bit of a continuum on this, and having discussions between Global Affairs Canada diplomats and intelligence agencies and spies and on the push-pull of what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what is problematic, is more of an art than a science. I mean, it can involve intent. It can involve whether it's a friendly country doing it or an unfriendly country doing it, why they're doing it, what preoccupations there are. There is nuance that is not just across departments, but even within departments. You can have different people within global affairs having a different perspective on that. And all those debates and discussions, I think, are a strength of our system that allow us to come to much more thoughtful answers or measures to take in complex and perhaps delicate situations. So, having those engaged, thoughtful debates in government, and even, quite frankly, to a certain extent, understanding that there are complexities in it for a public engaging with how to protect ourselves from foreign interference is very key. I think of the Baltic states example, when Canada positioned itself as the country lead on the enhanced forward presence in NATO by positioning troops in Latvia. One of the things that we learned about very quickly was the incredibly robust system that citizens in Latvia had to detect and deter and render ineffective Russian disinformation, because Russia is constantly flooding the zone in the Baltic states. And they have a very sophisticated and attentive population in knowing that this piece of information is just Russian propaganda or disinformation, that I think Canada is moving towards. But we are not as far forward as some other countries may be in terms of detecting misinformation and disinformation from hostile state actors.
So when these different perspectives may exist in government, do your officials make you aware of them so that you know that maybe CSIS has a different view on something from GAC?
Yes.
Does this come to your attention?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Either actually in person by watching the director of CSIS and the deputy minister of Foreign Affairs, have a conversation back and forth about a particular thing, or it is obvious in the briefings come to me where it says CSIS leans on this way, but the diplomats say that this might be it, and at the same time, the clerk's decision is this. One of the reasons that I've said I prefer to have active, engaged discussions around intelligence is it allows us to challenge and bring together those different points of view and different perspectives to get a better picture than simply one document that perhaps summarizes different elements but is written by one person in one department and not another.
Madame la commissaire, je vois que
Madam Commissioner, I see that I'm out of time, but I have still two topics to tackle with the Prime Minister, if you allow me. Yes, go ahead.
So, Prime Minister, the next, I do have a couple of more questions to ask you. The next one is on a different topic now. It's something that we spoke about at great length in camera, so I think we'll have the Reader's Digest of this conversation today, but the vulnerability of political party processes to foreign interference that has been raised à maintes fois in the Commission's proceedings. And we know that Elections Canada will soon be making some suggestions or recommendations as to things that might be done to ameliorate this situation. Can you give us your viewpoint on the idea of increased oversight or increased regulation of internal political party processes for the purpose of dissuading foreign interference?
First of all, there is already oversight and regulations over political parties in Canada that we all understand is important and necessary. I think of the very strict election financing rules, how a political party can raise money, how it is accountable for every dollar it raises, from whom it receives money, what it can spend the money on, how it needs to account for it. That's a really important principle that applies to all political parties and is sort of foundational for our democracy. So the idea that in our democracy we should regulate political parties is well established, that yes, there are many things in which it's important to uphold the freedom and openness of our democracy, that we regulate political parties. In C70, we actually indicate with greater clarity and legislate around foreign interference in political parties as being illegal. I mean, these are things that, yes, there are certainly things that governments and our democracy should do to ensure the accountability and responsibility of political parties. However, when we get into the issue of determining how a political party picks its candidates, or who gets to be the ultimate decision maker in a political party, or how to structure a political party internally, or how to run its nominations, we get into an area that I think one needs to tread very, very carefully. I mean, one of the things we see first in authoritarian countries like Venezuela, to use an extreme example, is the government regulating what opposition parties can do or say, or how they can organize themselves, or how they fund their fundraise. Is a great way for a party in government to control and render ineffective opposition parties. And that is the last thing that we would ever want in Canada. I think it's extremely important that political parties have a large degree of autonomy in their country, in their operations, independence in how they choose to operate and function as political parties, as opposition parties particularly. But that comes with it a responsibility by those political parties to be able to demonstrate the processes in place that they have to reassure Canadians, but particularly their members, that they are not arbitrary, they are not subject to whims or influence or interference by foreign interests or special interests across the country. That's why, for example, in our party we have nomination races that have very clear requirements that need to be hit within the party frame. We have an appeals process for anyone who loses a nomination. We have scrutineers and lawyers that every party gets to have on every candidate's team gets to have in the nomination process to ensure that it's a rigorous process. We have created many, many mechanisms like that because the Liberal Party has had nomination races of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people contesting for a single nomination. Sorry, 6,000, 7,000 members supporting a handful of candidates contesting for a particular nomination. Are there things that can be done to give political parties more information, better access to it? Well, the first one is making sure people, at least someone in a decision-making position at the top of the party structure, the party organization, the campaign director or someone like that, gets the necessary security clearance so that if CSIS or others see flags, they can carry that to the party or inform the leader about it so the leader can make sure that the processes, whether it's a leadership race or a nomination race, can account and say publicly, this was not interfered with. I think it's on the party itself to demonstrate the measures it has taken to protect itself from interference, rather than a government or even Elections Canada weighing in and saying, you have to do this, this, this to protect from foreign interference. I think it is better for Canadians and media and oppositions to be calling out where a party does not have robust processes in place and is not taking seriously the threats of foreign interference. But overly prescribing or regulating the organization, the behaviors, the structure, the decision-making processes within parties by what is necessarily one party in a position of power in government is something that I think requires a lot of caution. But there are many things that could be recommended for parties to take on as tools to keep them safe that I'm certainly hoping that Elections Canada and the Commission's work will highlight that are important principles for how parties can protect themselves from interference.
Okay. Moving now to a topic that you've raised on a couple of occasions already in your remarks, but not completely directly, is the classified NSICOP report. So, as you may know, the Commission was charged with looking into the NSICOP report and has done so. And we've heard some evidence over that process, which I will just highlight a couple of things that came out from that process and that investigation. One of them is some questions raised as to the strength of the conclusions that NSICOP expressed versus the strength of the assessments that CSIS actually made. So NSICOP's conclusions are NSICOP's, not CSIS's. There were also instances in which some discrepancies may have been found between the conclusions again made and the underlying intelligence. we've heard concerns in these proceedings from two of your former minister, Mr. Mendocino, current minister, Minister LeBlanc, about the strength of the public reaction to the NSICOP report. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that, having, of course, read the classified NSICOP report and having knowledge of its contents.
I created the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians for a very specific purpose: to make sure the parliamentarians from all different parties would be able to look into everything that our national security agencies are doing, with at least two clear goals. One is to make sure that our national security agencies are behaving appropriately and not violating Canadians' fundamental rights or overreaching or, or doing the bidding of one particular government versus the interests of Canadians. Just about every one of our major democracy partners has oversight by parliamentarians of their national security agencies. Canada did not, and the previous Conservative government refused to even begin to entertain the idea that parliamentarians should have the ability to oversee national security agencies. I felt strongly that we needed that, and that's why it was one of the first things that we did or worked on in terms of national security. The second reason NSICOP is important is the first reason is to make sure there's not overreach into, and there's other mechanisms as well, like NSIRA, to make sure there's not overreach into Canadians' fundamental rights. But the second is to make sure that national security agencies are taking seriously all the threats and acting in appropriate ways to counter the threats. But being a body that has only come into being about 8 years ago, and being one, or less than that, 6 years ago, being one that as recently as just a year or two ago in the House of Commons is still contested as to its legitimacy and usefulness, it's still very much in a learning process. It's trying to figure out how to manage a very multi-partisan structure in a highly polarized and partisan environment. When it comes to something like foreign interference, that is such a contentious and worrisome topic that you can imagine that any pronouncement that gets out, whether it's a criminal leaking information to the newspaper or NSICOP, putting out a report, or this commission's televised hearings, is generating a lot of interest. Did NSICOP get everything right in its report? As CSIS pointed out, there were some discrepancies. But I don't think that's automatically a bad thing. I think that's part of making sure there are different tools and different perspectives and different organizations working on similar challenges from different things. Yes, there's some of the things that NSICOP put in there that I really would have rather they didn't frame that way, because it worried Canadians and talked about traitors in Parliament, when that is not the assessment that our intelligence agencies put forward. But it's salacious and it sells newspapers and it worries Canadians, so it got put to the fore. I see this more as part of growing pains of building mature, not just institutions around national security within and around government and parliament, but of part of the learning process that citizens get to be part of in figuring out how to talk about real threats and how to evaluate in our democracy, where the lines are and how to best protect our democracy without harming the exact things that make us a free and open democracy. And those are sophisticated conversations that can't just happen within governments or within commissions, but can and should happen as part of active, engaged debate, discourse, and political conversations between elections and during elections. So, yeah, there's some things that I feel, certainly with all the perspective I have and all the direct briefings I have from CSIS, that they didn't get quite right. But I much rather have an effective and confident NSICOP committee that goes forth and draws its conclusions and says things that we will all learn to say, okay, yeah, they got this right. Maybe we're off a little bit on this, but this helps us advance this understanding. And CSIS was able to come out and correct the record on this. And some of the things that NSICOP talked about, CSIS had actually made a little bit of a mistake. And that was where NSICOP's report was. So that's thoughtful as well. So for me, it's all part of a system that is robust and serious, but because we're in a open, free democracy that stands up for everyone's rights, that is working hard to get it right, but that we don't always need to expect perfection from. And when, as consumers of intelligence materials, individuals and media and opposition parties become more and more experienced at it, more thoughtful about it, Canada will be even better served than we are right now in the important debates we have around foreign interference.
So maybe it's not about getting everything right, but contributing to the building of a national discourse.
Absolutely. Although it'd be nice to get more things right too at the same time.
Fair enough. Madame la Commissaire, ce sont mes questions.
Those are all my questions, Madam Commissioner.
And the answer